We are pleased to once again be joined by MLive's Ansar Kahn. He is a Detroit Red Wings and Detroit Pistons beat writer for MLive Media Group. Ansar, thank you for being with us again today.
Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you back. How have you been since we last spoke?
Good, good.
It's good to hear. Definitely a bit of a busier time now, I would presume, with sports being back in full motion. When we last spoke, the NBA and the NHL were still finalizing their plans for returning to live action. Now the NBA bubble is well underway. They're about halfway through the bubble play before they would have potentially play-in games for the playoffs and then the NBA playoffs after that. The NHL is well into its 24-team playoff as well. Both interesting concepts, a little bit similar and a little bit different. Do you believe, from what you've been seeing, are these concepts working well for the sport? Has it changed maybe the dynamics of these leagues or maybe even the excitement that comes along with watching professional sports at this time of the year, this late in the seasons?
Well, yes, certainly. First of all, I think, I was a little skeptical about whether they'd be able to pull this off, both the NBA and the NHL, under these COVID circumstances. But this bubble concept, this format, really seems to be working. We're seeing, they're having good success. Like you mentioned, both the NHL and NBA well underway, whereas baseball, which of course doesn't have not using the bubble format, they're having all kinds of problems. So, good for hockey and basketball. I think certainly, I think with the NHL playoffs have always been a bit unpredictable especially in the first round and a little bit in the second round. We see so many upsets. I mean, last year, who could have predicted Columbus, an 8th seed, would sweep Tampa Bay, which had one of the best all-time regular seasons ever. I mean, that's just the nature of the NHL. That uncertainty, the suspense is always going to be there, I think, in the Stanley Cup playoffs in the early rounds. NBA's, I've always found it to be, it's much different. I mean, you just don't have those upsets in the first round. I mean, there's such a large gap of separation and talent between the top teams and everybody else. And even though they're, like you said, they're still in the I guess what you'd call regular season play, the pre-playoff games here. But I think once they do get into the first round of the playoffs, I think it'll be business as usual. I think the top teams are going to have no trouble advancing. I think right now we're seeing a separation there in the NBA of really 4 teams that are standing out. In the West, the Lakers and the Clippers. In the East, Milwaukee and Toronto. Certainly those 4 teams I would say are favored, heavy favorites to advance to the Final Four. And really, I'd be surprised if anybody, even with this new format or with this different format of bubble and really no home court advantage, no traveling, everybody's in the same place. Adds a bit of uncertainty to it, but I still think in the end it's going to be those 4 teams in the Final Four.
I would agree with that too. I think that standing out in the NBA makes you a lot tougher of competition, especially if you're in a format of having a super team like you see out west with the Lakers and the Clippers and their big threes that they have there, especially with their dynamic duos in LA with LeBron James and Anthony Davis, with the Lakers, and then of course with the Clippers, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard as well. And then out east you have more of these more balanced teams but are really talented and have really prolific styles of basketball. Of course, the Milwaukee Bucks have Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's just an absolute powerhouse. And if he becomes a lights-out shooter, that team is the most deadly team potentially in the NBA. And the Toronto Raptors are the defending champions. It's been interesting also to see, even beyond those 4 teams that are more than likely going to be of which the eventual champion will come from, to see these other teams that are on the cusp of being potential contenders down the line in a few years, especially teams like the New Orleans Pelicans, who have a really interesting young roster with guys like Zion Williamson, of course, who's a future superstar in the NBA. Lonzo Ball's an interesting point guard. Brandon Ingram's arguably going to be the most improved player in the NBA. And on top of that, off the basketball court, we're able to see so much more of their personalities, as well as they have been cooped up in the bubble and have been a lot more active even than before on social media. Has this bubble, do you think that this bubble format and what we're experiencing now, particularly in the National Basketball Association, is going to change the future of how players interact with fans, how the NBA interacts and changes the fan experience, and what ways maybe do you see that potentially creating changes?
Oh, interesting. I'm not sure. This is such an unusual time, unusual situation, that hopefully we'll never see again. Certainly, I think with the NBA, especially since David Stern became commissioner, they really do an excellent job of promoting their star players. These guys, the top players in the league are world renowned. I mean, they're marketed so heavily, and certainly that hasn't changed, and I don't expect that to change. You mentioned, guys like Antetokounmpo and Zion and Williamson, certainly the next wave here. That's something that I think baseball is always, for example, has always struggled with. I mean, aside from like Mike Trout, the top players in baseball, I just don't get as much exposure, it seems, and baseball doesn't do a good enough job of promoting those guys. But I think the NBA, it will always be good in that regard, and you will see the top players promoted, and they will get that exposure. Certainly, Zion is right at the top of the list as far as the next wave.
Someone such as myself, I'm a fan, but not a big fan of sports. Not having that fan experience, not being able to go into the ballparks, do you think fans are going to turn away? How many are going to return?
Yeah, I think when it does open up back again, hopefully next year, I don't think we'll see it at first. I think after being away for as long as they have been, the fans, I think they'll come back. They'll be eager to get back and watch the games in person. But I think overall, I think maybe one of the fears is that during this whole pandemic, that people have found other ways for their time, and maybe some people have figured, well, we can really do without sports, that it's not as big a deal. I think that's one of the challenges that these leagues might face going forward. But I think after the true hardcore fans, after not being able to go to games for quite some time here, I think we'll be eager to get back into it once the leagues open up again to fans. Hopefully at the start of next season. Whether they can maintain that remains to be seen.
Ansar Kahn with us. He is a Detroit Red Wings and Detroit Pistons beat writer for MLive Media Group with us on the Oakland County Megacast. So transitioning from teams that are currently playing ball, that are competing potentially for championships in the NHL and in the NBA in particular. In Detroit, different story. The Detroit Red Wings not in the 2014 playoff in the NHL. The Detroit Pistons not in the NBA bubble down in Orlando. Both teams very much in a rebuilding phase. Both have a lot of young talent and are looking at high draft picks coming up. Of course, the Red Wings had a high chance at the number 1 overall pick. They did not get that in the draft lottery. They'll be picking the just a few selections lower, and the Pistons currently are on track to have a high lottery draft pick. Let's start with the Detroit Pistons. They bring in a new GM in Troy Weaver, an excellent evaluator of talent from the Oklahoma City Thunder organization. He's well into his job. He's filling out his staff. He's working with Dwayne Casey, and they're focusing now on the offseason. Free agents potentially they could bring in, but more importantly, adding to this young core on the Pistons squad and looking at particularly point guard, but other key positions, as there's a lot of talent in this upcoming draft. For those who are not as familiar, maybe more casual fans of Pistons basketball, who are a few guys in this upcoming draft that Pistons fans should be aware of as guys that may potentially be joining this team wherever the Pistons may select, as high as number 1 overall or even as low as number 8?
Yeah, draft lottery, I believe, is August the 20th.
Yes.
They moved it up. It'll be interesting. The Pistons have, I believe, a 10.5% chance at that top pick. And I think 40%, somewhere in the 40s of selecting the top 4. They could drop as low as 8. It's really a kind of a balanced draft at the top. There's not that one consensus top pick like there has been in so many years. You look at mock drafts and there's any number of players projected to go number 1. But like you mentioned, the Pistons, I think ideally they would like to get a point guard. That's their biggest need. Although, Troy Weaver says certainly that wherever they're selecting, they'll be more inclined to just go with the best player, regardless of position, who they have rated on their board. But certainly, if they could get a point guard, that would be the best case scenario. LaMelo Ball is one of the higher rated ones. Killian Hayes, a player who played in Germany. Tyrese Halliburton from Iowa State, another top point guard. Those probably are the top 3, all projected to go within the top 10. A lot of people think Ball might even be the top overall pick. But if the Pistons could get one of those guys, point guard, another position of need, a center, although centers aren't quite as valuable, it seems, in today's NBA. But there's a 7'1" center who played briefly at Memphis, James Wiseman, who's expected to go likely in the top 3. That's another position that the Pistons could use. But overall, I'd say if they could get one of those top 3 point guards, it would be a very good draft for them.
Yeah, there's so much parity in the NBA lottery this year in terms of wherever the ping pong balls fall and whoever has those top 4 picks, and then of course below is determined by record. Any number of combinations can create a completely different scenario for that draft lottery. It'll be really interesting to see where the cards fall and who might come down to the Detroit Pistons, or who the Pistons may go up to get if they are to rise to number 1 or into those top 4 picks in the NBA draft. Just a couple more minutes with you, Ansar Kahn from MLive Media Group. Let's talk about the Detroit Red Wings. Similar situation, young team, developing team, relatively new GM and Steve Yzerman with the team leading their rebuild. They're a little bit similar to the Detroit Pistons, and they're still in the early rebuild phase, but they have a lot of young talent coming up in their minor league system. They're going to have another high draft pick. For Red Wings fans who are clamoring to have the Red Wings back into the NHL playoffs, contending for a championship, how far away do you believe that this team is from being in playoff contention, from being at least in playoff contention?
A playoff contention, I would say at least a couple of years. I don't see them, certainly not next season. I mean, this team was really historically bad this season. The 3rd worst points percentage in franchise history. They finished, I believe, 23 points below the next worst team. Which certainly when one team is that bad compared to the rest, it really points out the inequities of the draft lottery. and that they only had an 18.5% chance of winning it, and that they drop all the way to fourth. Certainly doesn't seem like an equitable system, but yeah, they're at least a couple years away from even competing for a playoff spot, as I see it. If they would have gotten that number one pick, and Alexis Lafreniere is certain to be that top selection by all accounts. Could have been a bit of a game changer, but where they're selecting at number 4, whoever they choose is not going to, highly unlikely that he'll be able to help immediately. He'll need more than likely 1 or 2 years of development time before joining the NHL. So it's still going to be a while yet before we see the Red Wings in the playoffs.
Well, Ansar, thank you very much for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
Appreciate it. Ansar Kahn from MLive Media Group, a Detroit Red Wings and Pistons beat writer for them.